This talk today is co-sponsored with the Middlebury Center for Social Entrepreneurship and also the Department of Philosophy, Education and Action, and the Christian A. Johnson Foundation. Mary is a senior research scholar at Babson. In addition to that position, she's a senior advisor to the Aspen Institute Business and Society program. Previously, she was a faculty member and manager of case research at the Harvard Business School. As director of Giving Voice to Values, a business curriculum launched by Aspen Institute and Yale School of Management, and now based and funded at Babson, Dr. Gentile is leading a pioneering approach to values-driven leadership that has been featured in Financial Times, Harvard Business Review twice, Strategy and Business, Stanford Social Innovation Review, McKinsey Quarterly, Biz Ed, the list really does go on. And her work is this program, GVV, which you'll hear about, is being piloted in over 125 business schools and organizations globally. Her book, which Heather has a copy of to display to you, Giving Voice to Values, How to Speak Your Mind When You Know What's Right, was published in 2010 by Yale University Press. Please join me in welcoming Mary.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here today, and I've very much been enjoying my initial sort of welcome to Middlebury. This is my first time here. My first time in Vermont. I live in Boston, and I kind of just go over the edge, but I've been told that doesn't count. But I've really been enjoying it. I just met with a group of students over in, I guess it's the EIA building a little while ago, and I was blown away. I mean, just such an incredibly articulate and thoughtful group. So I'm looking forward to talking with you all today. What I plan to do is to talk to you about Giving Voice to Values, or GVV as I refer to it. What I thought I would do is, as John told you, GVV is it's an innovative, it's a new curriculum, a new pedagogy for teaching about and thinking about, talking about, and acting on our values in the workplace. And I thought I would tell you basically my story, the story of how it developed, the rationale behind it, why it developed. I wanted to tell you that story because I think really understanding where it came from in me will help you understand better what GVV is. But I also wanted to tell the story that way because I know this is an event that's sponsored by the Center for Social Entrepreneurship. I didn't think of myself in any way as a social entrepreneur when I was starting GVV. I really was thinking of myself as an educator. But my boss, the president of Babson College, Len Schlesinger, when he recruited me, he pointed out that it really was an entrepreneurial venture that I was engaged in. And that kind of surprised me, but it actually has given me a new lens for looking at what I'm doing, which is actually, I think, enabled me to do even more. So I wanted to just put that frame around it because I thought it might be interesting for our conversation later. What I hope to do today is to talk to you for maybe 40 minutes, 45 minutes or so, tell you the story. I don't use any PowerPoints or anything, it's just a story. And then we can hopefully have a conversation. And because of the way I'm going to tell the story, I invite you to ask me questions about teaching business ethics if you want. I invite you to ask me questions about starting this kind of a social enterprise, if you like, or anything else. So that's by way of introduction. John has already told you, the commercial that this was sponsored and we got our venture funding from the Yale School of Management and the Aspen Institute, and we're now based at Babson. The good news is that we're now in well over 300 schools and organizations on all 7 continents. These are the ones we know about, because as you will hear in this story, that we've made this curriculum available on the internet for free. So we actually know it's being used in a lot more places. We have thousands of people on our mailing list who, we only know they're using it if they write to ask a question. So it's kind of encouraging. We get emails all the time from people talking about their use of GVV without that we didn't know it was happening. Increasingly, although it was developed as something for business schools, initially for MBA programs, increasingly it's being used in undergraduate business education and executive education. It's being used in the liberal arts, medical schools, nursing schools, legal schools, schools of engineering are starting to adapt it. And increasingly businesses are using it. Lockheed Martin is the company that's gone the furthest with it. They've used it for 2.5 years now. They started out using it around ethics and compliance, and now they're starting to think about using it to move into a kind of internal peer coaching and leadership development. McKinsey, the consulting firm, has decided to pilot it in their leadership development for their senior partners. Walmart is beginning to think about ways to use it in Southeast Asia, so we're expanding. But let me step back now and tell you the story. So, to begin with this story, I spent most of my professional career working in business education. As John told you, I kind of cut my teeth in business schools at the Harvard Business School, where I started as a case writer and moved my way up to faculty. I was there for 10 years. Then I left and I consulted for about 15 years independently to business schools around the world. And I was always working in the area of business ethics, values, leadership, diversity management, those kinds of issues. And about the turn of the last century, late 1990s, I had what I call a crisis of faith. And I began to feel that maybe trying to teach business ethics in a business school was unethical. You can tell I'm kind of an earnest person to have that kind of a feeling, but I did. And I kind of want to tell you why. I had been working, one of my first major roles at HBS was to help them to design and teach in their first required ethics curriculum. And then I was working in faculty at other schools as well, and I saw what typically happened. So the first thing I saw is that typically when people wanted to teach about business ethics in a business classroom, and this started out in my work with MBAs, but I see similar things in undergraduate classrooms. Typically what they'll do is they'll pick some really thorny, troubling ethical dilemma. One of those situations where it's really gray. It's a little right, it's a little wrong, it's a systemic issue. It's not just about somebody, choosing to be good or bad. It's really complicated. And they'll share that kind of a case. And the students will come into the classroom and maybe they'll walk into the classroom thinking they have an idea of what the right thing to do is. But through the course of the discussion, they're going to understand that this is a whole lot more complicated than they thought. It's not as clear what's right. There's also a lot of unintended consequences, even if you're trying to do the right thing. This is all a good thing, right? You want people to be thinking rigorously about these issues. But the other thing that happens in the classroom is that usually the voice in the classroom, that is the one that everyone turns to listen to when he or she speaks. The people who are the most articulate, the most persuasive, the ones who seem the most politically savvy, they've kind of been around the organizational block. These are usually the ones who are raising their hand to voice the most skeptical, if not cynical, positions about ethics in this discussion or this classroom. So what often happens at best after this discussion is that students walk out with the sense that that was an engaging intellectual debate. It was not clear that what was the right thing to do, nor whether there maybe even was a right thing to do. And I certainly don't know what to do about it if there was. So that's the good side. At worst, students walk out feeling kind of disempowered about the whole thing because they've been hearing the more cynical or the more skeptical side of it. So that was kind of discouraging at the one level. The second thing that kind of led to my crisis of faith was, I was working in this field for a long enough time that I would see that every 5 or 6 years there'd be a spate of scandals that would hit the papers. In the 70s, there were the defense contractor scandals. In the 80s, there's the insider trading scandals. In the 90s, there were a whole bunch of things, 90s and 2000s. I'm sure you all can think about the list, the Enrons, the Arthur Andersons, the Gallian groups, the Parmalots, etc., etc. So, Goldman Sachs. So, so every few years these things would happen, and what would happen is that there'd be a whole spate of articles in the newspaper about what the heck are they teaching in business schools? Because typically on the front page of the paper there'd be MBAs from the leading business schools in handcuffs. There would be alumni calling their deans saying, "I'm worried about the devaluation of the brand here." There'd be donors who would be coming forward saying, "Look, you need to hire somebody, create a course, design a center. You need to do something about this. So this would happen, every few years. It seemed it was every 5 or 6 years. Now it seems like it's much more frequently than that. The other thing that sort of struck me was, I guess this was also in the early 2000s. There's a Center for Ethics in California at Santa Clara University. It's called the Markela Center for Professional Ethics, and they decided they wanted to do a debate, and the debate was going to be on business ethics. And they were going to have two people on one side of the debate. And these people were going to say, after 25 or 30 years of good faith efforts trying to teach business ethics in business schools, we have made a huge amount of progress. And then on the other side of the debate, they're going to have two people who would say, after 25 years, we've made no progress. And what was telling is they were having trouble finding people to be on the side of the debate who were saying we've made progress. They asked me to be on that side of the debate, and in good conscience, I struggled with it. So, there were all these things were kind of piling up, and I was thinking, life is short. You want to do something that matters. I was beginning to feel that these ethics classes that we were working on designing and teaching in good faith, and I had colleagues who were really smart and really excellent teachers, I began to feel that it was really a matter of checking the boxes, because I really didn't think they were having any kind of positive impact or any kind of practical impact through these educational classes. So I decided life is short. I'm going to take a step back from this work. I want my life to mean something. So I thought, I'm going to look around, do something else. So around that time, and again, like I say, this was around the late 1990s, I got a consulting gig. I still wasn't sure what I was going to do when I grew up, but I got this consulting gig at Columbia Business School. And they asked me to come in to work on something slightly different. They wanted me to work on finding social and environmental curriculum to put into the MBA. But at the same time, they were also a group of faculty that were working on ethics. And they knew about my background. And so they said, do you want to look at what we're doing? Are you curious? So I said, sure. So they said, let's show you what we've been doing. So this is what they were doing. They were asking all the incoming MBA students at Columbia, which at the time was about 600 students in a cohort, upon matriculation, during orientation, to answer one question. And this is the question. The question was, tell us about a time in your work experience when you were asked or told to do something that conflicted with your own values and what you did about it. And just write a paragraph, no more than a page. You don't have to put your name on it. You don't have to name organizations, and share this. So they collected these essays from all the incoming students, and they let me read them. So I read hundreds and hundreds of these essays, well over 1,000 over several years. And it was really interesting. Now, it's not scientific data. It was self-reporting, but it was very provocative. And it forms one of the pieces that triggered the development of giving voice to values. So I want to tell you what we heard, what we learned. So the first thing we learned when we started reading these essays is that if you think about the kind of people who go to a school like Columbia, most of them, at least at that time, had already been in the workplace for 3 or 4 or 5 years before they went into the MBA program. So the first thing we saw is that I could probably count on one hand the number of these students who said, I was never asked or told to do something that violated my values. They pretty much all had a story to tell. That's the first thing. The second thing we learned is that when you think about the kinds of people who go to a school like Columbia again, certain industries are more heavily represented than others. There's a lot of people, it's in New York, there's a lot of people from the financial sector, a lot of people from the big consulting firms of the world, the McKinseys of the world, a lot of people from, the big pharmaceutical firms, some high tech. So because certain industries were more heavily represented, the kinds of conflicts and challenges they were describing also got repetitious pretty quickly. So we heard a lot of stories about people who were told to inflate or deflate their billable hours in a way that didn't really reflect how much time they were spending, but in a way that would maximize the firm's revenue or serve some other firm-specific goal. Or there were people who were told to alter or replace the equations or the benchmarks they used to evaluate the relative attractiveness or lack of attractiveness of a particular financial transaction in order to encourage the client of the firm to take the action that would maximize revenue to the firm. Okay? Or there would be people who would say, I was encouraged to puff up, to inflate the capabilities of a new product, whether it was a new software product or a new pharmaceutical product, a new drug, beyond what we actually knew that product could do from the research data at that point. Again, in order to maximize revenues. People, especially people who are working cross borders, we talk about a number of challenges around corruption, around bribery, dealing with public sector situations, and there were always the ubiquitous human resource issues. Issues around fairness and hiring and firing and discrimination. So the scenarios got repetitious pretty quickly. But what was interesting is that the responses differed. And the responses fell into some very clearly recognizable buckets. So the first bucket, the largest bucket, a little more than half of them, said, yes, I encountered a values conflict and it bothered me. It didn't just roll off my back. But I really didn't think I had any options. So I just did what they told me to do. I just sucked it up and did what they told me to do. That was the largest group. And then there was a small group who said, yeah, I encountered this values conflict. It bothered me so much I couldn't bring myself to do it. But I also didn't think I had any real options. And so I tried to just remove myself from the situation. So some of these people got themselves transferred to a different work group or a different manager. And a few of them even quit their jobs. But this was a small group. Now the remainder of the whole group, so now we're at about a third of them, said, yep, I encountered values conflict and I tried to do something about it. And a small group of those people said, I tried and I failed. But about a quarter of the whole group said, I tried, and by my lights, I was successful. So we thought, again, acknowledging that this was not, scientific data, but it was interesting. We thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting to look at these stories and look and see, are there any patterns that we can see so that we can identify some differences between the people who were able to do this effectively and the people who were not. So we started to look at the stories and try and organize them in different ways, looking at industry, looking at backgrounds of individuals, looking at the kinds of situations. And it didn't seem that one group was more morally troubled than another group, right? It didn't seem that it had anything to do with that. Because by definition, the question was, tell us about a time when your values conflicted with what you were asked to do. So that didn't seem to be the distinction. We weren't sorting good and bad people here. And it didn't seem that one group was more politically savvy, organizationally skillful than another group. Because some of the people who found ways to voice and act on their values were really, really clever. I mean, they came up with these ingenious win-wins, or they were very persuasive. And, but some of them were kind of clumsy in the way they did it, and even naive in the way they did it. And that didn't seem to be the difference. So in the end, the only thing we could really say was that was a distinction was that the people who were able to do this at some point said something outside of their own heads. And it might have started out by talking to a spouse or a partner or a friend, but eventually it found its way into the organization and it changed the trajectory of things. So when I heard that, I got discouraged again because I thought, I don't really think there's anything I can do with that from an educator's perspective, from a pedagogical perspective. It just, I had been hopeful that maybe we were going to have some little hook here about how to teach this differently, and I just didn't see that. But then I remembered some research that I had seen years earlier when I was still at HBS. And this was research, there were two studies actually, Douglas Hunnicky and Perry London. And this was research about moral courage and altruism. And these guys had decided that they were going to try and do in-depth interviews with people who had acted with great courage on behalf of someone else in times of great stress, great trial, great risk, personal risk. And so they decided the way to do it would be to identify rescuers from World War II, people who had put their lives at stake to help other people who were in danger during the Holocaust. And they would identify a bunch of these people and they would do in-depth interviews with them. So that was their approach. And, as it is usually the way with that kind of research, if you do those kinds of interviews and you look for something, you tend to find it. And so they found a list of things that people tended to share. And to be honest, I don't remember most of them. But one of them really resonated with me then when I was at HBS, and it came back to me now. It probably resonated because I was an educator. But they said the people who were able to act in this kind of way, take these kinds of risks, behave in such a in this really courageous way in these situations on behalf of others, all reported that at an earlier point in their lives, usually as young adults, they had had the experience of rehearsing out loud with someone more senior to them, someone they respected, a boss, a teacher, a mentor, even a parent, the experience of rehearsing out loud, what would you do if? And then various kinds of moral conflicts. So there seemed to be this experience they had that operated both at the cognitive and intellectual level and also at the behavioral and the experiential level, which is that at the cognitive level they were both defining what value mattered to them in the circumstances being discussed, but they were also finding a way to articulate it. They were scripting the words they would use, the way they would express what mattered. At the behavioral level, they were actually voicing a commitment, and they were voicing a commitment to someone more senior who stood in as proxy for the kind of person they might need to communicate with in an actual situation. So I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. It seemed that there was an emphasis here on rehearsal. So we thought that was an interesting idea, and maybe we would delve into it a little bit. So we started to look at the research, we started to interview scholars, and we also started to interview practitioners, business people, at all levels, from right out of school, right out of their BAs or their MBAs, all the way up to CEOs and C-suite people, boards of directors. And we did a couple things. With the practitioners, we asked questions about, tell us about times when you encountered values conflicts and how you handled them. With the researchers, we looked at some of these questions about voice and about rehearsal. And what we began to find is that at that point, and this was probably about 5 or 6 years ago now, and there's even more now, but at that point there was a lot of research that was coming from a lot of different disciplines that was suggesting that if you want to change behavior, it's not necessarily primarily or first a cognitive or an intellectual thing. It's a behavior thing. If you want to change behavior rather than trying to persuade people, get them to act differently first. Rather than thinking your way into a different way of acting, act your way into a different way of thinking is the way it usually gets paraphrased. And there was research in social psychology. You've probably seen a lot of this research around habits. There was research in even the field of cognitive neurosciences, which is not my field, but some of the scholars I interviewed told me about it in terms of creating neural pathways that made certain kinds of behaviors more of a default. There was even research in the field of kinesthetics, study of movement. And I always like to use that example because for me it's memorable. So I'm going to just tell you the story there. When I was back in my days at HBS, I decided to take a self-defense class. Now, I had never in my life felt the need to take a self-defense class until I went to work at Harvard Business School. I'm not sure if those two are connected, but I did feel the need to take a class then. So I took this class, and the class I took was a class called Model Mugging. Now, I think it still exists, but I think they have a new name. But they had a slightly different approach. So instead of just teaching you the traditional moves of self-defense, fist to bridge of nose and heel to instep and knee to groin, instead of just teaching you those, they did teach you those, but then they would have this guy come into the room dressed up in this padded suit, like the Michelin Man, and he would attack you full force, and you would get to use these moves, on him, full force. And at first, you would all be standing in line waiting to get attacked, and you would use your moves, right? But then as the class went on over weeks, he would sneak in when you didn't expect him. He'd sneak up behind you unexpectedly. It was really nerve-wracking. But the idea behind it was this research called specific state muscle memory, which is basically the idea that if you learn and practice to do something in the emotional and intellectual and physical, physiological state you're going to be in when you need to use it, even if your brain freezes, your body remembers. So that's kind of what we're talking about here. This is kind of creating a different default, creating a kind of moral muscle memory is really what we're talking about. So I thought, okay, this is really interesting. There's all this research in the field of social psychology, neuroscience, all this research that suggests rehearsal is important, practice in changing behavior, and influencing behavior. So the next question is, what do we rehearse in the business school classroom? Well, then I got depressed again, because what I was seeing in the business school classroom was not positive when it came to that. I mean, I told you about how often the way you showed you were smart and the way you showed you were sophisticated, you've been around the block, was by taking a more cynical or skeptical position. But beyond that, I started to look back at all the work I've done with business school faculty from many different disciplines, from finance, marketing, operations management, as well as ethics, who had been working on designing ethics classes at a lot of different business schools, not just HBS. And what they would typically say, and what I would typically say in good faith, is what we're trying to do in the classroom is teach two things. We're trying to teach awareness and analysis. So what we meant by awareness is we're trying to expose students to the kinds of scenarios they might encounter in the workplace that have an ethical component to them, so we'll recognize them when we see them. Now, this is an important thing. It's especially an important thing when people are working more and more in global business contexts, where you're in an environment that is different than the one you may have grown up in, so you're seeing practices that are different than what you're used to. It's also a very important thing in a world of rapid technological advancement, where our ideas about and our sort of shared consensus about, what is right when it comes to privacy or information security or intellectual property, all those ideas are evolving, while we're sitting here, because you can do more things in more ways, more rapidly. So, awareness is important. We want to make sure people know what's going on. However, as necessary as it is, I concluded it was not sufficient. Because if you look at the kinds of things that I was talking about at the beginning of my remarks, the kinds of stories that hit the front pages of the newspapers that make us say, oh my God, what are we teaching in business school? Those are stories that usually are not these new age or, cutting edge sort of ethical dilemmas. These are like fraud, and illegality, kind of clear-cut illegality. People get caught, but it's not all that complicated. So just because so it seems that awareness is good, but that just because you're aware, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be able to handle these situations. So awareness, necessary, not sufficient. The second thing we always would say we wanted to teach was analysis. And what we meant by that is it will teach you the models of ethical reasoning that will allow you to discipline your thinking, to become more rigorous in the way you reason through a particular ethical challenge. So this is good because it means I won't assume that just because I think it's right, that you think it's right, and vice versa. It will allow me to really think carefully about some of these complicated issues. And the way we would do that is that we would take the models, we'd borrow the models from philosophy, right? So we would look at things like utilitarianism, or deontology, or virtue-based ethics, and rights-based ethics. We'd teach those models of ethical thinking from philosophy and apply them to business situations. We might dress them up. I remember being in a number of business schools where they were always looking for ways to summarize, thousands of pages of philosophical tracts into an 8-page framework. So usually utilitarianism would become cost-benefit analysis, or something like that, and the philosophers would pull out their hair. But, the idea was that they were helping people to try and reason through issues more carefully. Now, again, this is a good thing. clear thinking is a good thing, I also think it's really not sufficient. And I think the best way to illustrate that is to tell you another story. This did not come from a self-defense class, but this came from the interviews I was doing. I think I told you I did a lot of interviews with business people, and one of the guys I interviewed was a CEO and entrepreneur, quite successful, of a consumer products firm, his firm, based in the U.S., and privately held. And I remember having this conversation with him because somebody told me, you should talk to this guy. He's really concerned about both values and business education. So we were having a conversation, and at one point he said, you know, Mary, whenever I hire an MBA in this company, it's my company, that's a big hire for me. And so I have my staff do all the screening of candidates. But when they've identified the person that they think is the best candidate, I do the final interview. And if I agree, I will offer him or her the job. So he said he had recently had a young man in his office who had just finished his MBA at one of the top business schools in the U.S., and he was interviewing him. And he was asking him about his business school experience. And he asked the guy, he said, did you take a business ethics class when you were doing your MBA? And the guy said, well, yeah, it was required. And so the CEO said, well, what did you learn? And he said, well, I learned all the models of ethical reasoning, deontology, utilitarianism, virtue-based ethics. And then I learned that whenever you encounter a values conflict, you decide what you want to do. And then you select the model of ethical reasoning that will best support what you want to do. Now, needless to say, this was not what the professor had been intending the student to take away from that class. And the guy was telling, the CEO, when he was telling the story to me, he had this kind of wry smile. He was sort of yanking my chain because I was the ethics lady, But there's a certain amount of truth to this, right? Because by design, these models of reasoning are supposed to conflict. That's their value. The whole idea is that if you look at something from only a utilitarian perspective, you might fall prey to the tyranny of the majority. And so you do want to look at issues of duties or rights to balance that out. So by design, these are just ways to make you think clearly. They don't tell you what the right answer is. And even more importantly, once you've decided what's right, they certainly don't tell you how to get it done. So that's what I decided at that point. What we're rehearsing in the business school classroom is awareness and analysis. Really good stuff. Definitely not sufficient. And what we need to add is the third A, or action. So in other words, instead of only or always asking the question, what is the right thing to do in any situation? That's an important question. But we need to also ask, once you know what's right, how do you get it done in a business environment, in a particular industry, in a particular organization, given your role as a junior person in the organization, as a middle-level manager, or as a senior leader. And so we thought, well, maybe that's what we need to do. We need to give the students a chance to actually rehearse the literal scripts and the action plans. We need to look at positive examples of people who found ways to do this. Not the inspirational, great man theory of business ethics. When I was at HBS, we also did that. Again, very well intended. But we decided we would create a bunch of cases about people who had done these terrific things. So, this is the Tylenol case, talking about, taking a stand and doing the right thing. The irony about some of those, hero cases is that it's kind of human nature. What the students would do is that there would be two things. Both of them were negative. The first thing is that you kind of want to poke holes in it, right? You kind of want to say, well, yeah, maybe Johnson & Johnson did the right thing then, but let me tell you what they did, and then they'll talk about, Johnson & Johnson has had its share of bad acting stories, right? So there's always this, you kind of want to poke holes in it. You kind of want to say, this is not the whole story. Not because we're only cynical or skeptical, but because we definitely do not want to be duped. In fact, I actually think that desire to poke holes in it really kind of comes from a sort of earnestness in people, where, you kind of like to believe it's possible to do the right thing and be successful, but you don't want to be duped. And you know that these organizations have also had bad stories. So that was the one thing that would happen. The other negative thing that would happen is that if a student was truly impressed by the behavior of the actor in the case. There was also, they were presented as heroes. It was presented as these kind of actions that were, well beyond the mere mortal, and taken at great risk. And there was often a quiet, small voice in many of the students about, well, I'm not sure I'd do that. I'm not sure I'd have the courage, or I'm not sure I'd want to pay the potential price, or whatever it was. So, although well-intended, we began to worry that some of those hero stories were not always the most effective. So we decided we do want to look for positive examples, but we want them to be more at the tactical level. We want them to be more at the practical level. We want them to be less about what a great guy he is or what a great woman she is, but more about how did this person find a way to get around this challenge that I might actually face tomorrow? And are there some tools or some strategies or some arguments that I could borrow from this and use in my own life? So we decided if we want to teach this way, we have to create a different teaching technology. When I was at HBS, I wrote a bunch of cases, and I used to manage and run their case writing program. So I knew what the traditional business school case study model is, and so do you guys. They tend to be 15 or 20 pages long. They tend to feature a senior manager, often the CEO. They usually end with the CEO leaning back in his chair, usually his chair, looking out the window and saying, what should I do, And then the students spend 90 minutes debating either side. These are great cases for teaching analysis. They are not necessarily very good vehicles for teaching action. So we decided, okay, we're going to create a different kind of case. These cases, the GVV cases, are very short. They're often just a paragraph. Sometimes they're a few pages. They feature people at every level, people right out of school, people middle managers, and senior managers. But the biggest difference is they all end with a protagonist who has already decided what he or she thinks the right thing to do is. And the question isn't what should they do or what is the right thing to do. The question is, how can they get it done? What do they need to say? To whom? In what sequence? What data do they need to collect? What examples can they draw from, either from their own firm or from the industry? Positive examples, negative examples. What ways can they reframe the situation and the argument? And when they do raise this, what will the pushback be? What will the objections be? And then what might they say in response to those? And, do they do this one-on-one? Or is this really something that has to be done in a coalition or incrementally? And is this something where it's an individual decision, or is this something that's really a systemic problem? And so what they need to do is to reach out to other organizations to work on it together, etc., etc. It's very tactical, practical, strategic, literal scripting. And then we have a process that we ask students to go through where they practice, they create scripts, and they action plan, and they peer coach each other. They come and share their best strategy for how to deal with the situation. And then you in the class, in the audience, will say, okay, this was really persuasive, but this part wasn't. But let me help you think of a way to make it more persuasive. So for the sake of the GVV exercise, it's not a forced debate where somebody gets to practice the so-called ethical position and someone else gets to rehearse the so-called unethical position, but rather it's a situation where we're all invited to try and come up with the most effective strategy and script. So anyways, we thought, well, this is an interesting idea, let's play with it. So we created hundreds of pages of these kinds of cases. We also created a lot of other exercises and readings that sort of build the skills. We drew on a lot of the research out there now about decision-making biases and heuristics and reframing problems so that people could use that in the service of coming up with persuasive scripts. We created a lot of materials this wasn't designed for the ethics class. We wanted it to be taught by the accounting professor, the marketing professor, the finance professor. So there's scenarios that could easily be fit into those classes, and that the scripts you're creating, they're not about using philosophy. Because if your colleague in the internal audit function of your company is asking you to cook the books, you're not going to go and try and argue with him and her by appealing to Aristotle. You're going to go and argue with them by using the language of accounting in a business. And so the idea was this was easier for faculty who were not philosophers in the business school to teach because the students were actually practicing the language, the vocabulary, and the tools and the analytics that they wanted to teach. So this was the idea behind it. We created hundreds of pages of this stuff. We put it all online for free. And then we started reaching out to a network of faculty around the world and said, would you pilot this? So this is where I found out accidentally after the fact that we were being social entrepreneurs because we were actually building a movement. We were building a network. So what happened is faculty saw it as in their interest to pilot this. We weren't trying to sell them something. We were trying to actually solve a problem they already had. The people started using it. We started getting feedback. The other nice thing about it was that as faculty got excited about it, as students got excited about it, they would start creating more cases based on their own experiences. And since we had given the materials all available to them for free, they then said, well, you can use our materials and post them and also make them available for free. And what we gave those people in return was a byline. They got a publication, they got a global platform for their work, and they got to retain the IP if they ever wanted to publish it somewhere else as well. So, eventually more and more people started participating in that. The book came out, which was nice, but pretty much everything in the book is already online for free, so I had to negotiate that with Yale Press, because, when you publish a book, there's all these issues around copyright, and I had to say, look, I'm not going to take this offline. This is the problem for you. And fortunately, I had an enlightened editor who said, actually, I think having stuff online will drive sales because people like to have the package. And he was right. That's what happened. In fact, increasingly now, people are asking us to translate the book into other languages, so that's a good thing. And then we started getting other sorts of expressions of interest. Businesses would say, could we use this in corporate training? Because what they typically did in corporate training was their own approach to awareness and analysis. They would teach them the rules, the policies and the laws. That's kind of awareness. And the analysis is they give you a scenario and they say, is this over the line or not? And you would decide. But now what they started doing, Lockheed Martin started doing this first, is they would create scenarios where somebody had actually already stepped over the line. That's how Lockheed did it. But then they went back, they flashed back, and they said, what could he or she have done at these 2, 3, or 4 points along the way to have stopped this before it got to this point? What could you have said to your boss and to your colleagues that they might actually listen to? It might have been persuasive. And they started doing that. They got very good responses from the employees to these kinds of trainings. They both said that they enjoyed them, but they also said, I actually took some tools away here I could use. The best sort of story was when it was piloted the first time. Usually they're asked they get a selection of 8 or 9 of these, and you can choose 2 or 3 scenarios to teach. And those employees said, "Can we do more?" Because they actually were finding them useful. Other companies, Lockheed now and now McKinsey are saying, maybe we should look at this as not just ethics training. This is really leadership development. Because the skills you're learning here are really about being able to be effective at voicing and acting on your values in all kinds of situations. And isn't that what leadership is? And then even beyond that, when I started this work, I thought it was about learning to voice your values negatively, learning to say no when someone was asking or telling you to do something that you thought was wrong. But increasingly, we started looking at issues, sustainability issues, social and environmental impact, and we started realizing, you can use the same approaches, practicing how you can voice your values affirmatively, how you can encourage your organization to start doing something positive that they haven't been doing. It's not just about voicing values negatively. So these are the things that are all happening. At this point now, we're traveling around the world. I'm basically in 2 or 3 places every week. And there's a lot of interest in this. And I'm at the point where I'm actually starting to ask my audiences for advice, because we're trying to figure out, okay, when you've got something that's at this point of growing, and I think this is a natural thing with social enterprises, there's also a point where you have to figure it's got to grow beyond certain sort of initial people and initial approaches to figure out a way to really amplify it. So we're trying to use lots of connecting technologies. I told you we put it all online for free, but now we're starting to try and create e-learning modules that could be adapted in many different ways. Our first client is to do this for a professional association that works with corporations, and so they'll be doing a webinar using the e-modules and the instructor part as well online for business people. But we're thinking, let's design those in such a way that they could be used for faculty to get more comfortable with these issues, and maybe for students, But we're also looking for other ways to expand this, because it seems like that's what's necessary. We're starting to partner with more organizations. So we're partnering with Net Impact. Some of you may know about them. They are an organization originally for MBA students, but now for business school undergraduates as well as alumni who are interested in social responsibility and values in their business careers. And so they're creating a career program to be offered both at the undergraduate or the MBA level that's really about how do you learn to talk about your values in your career search and in your early career experience. And can we use some of the tools of GVB to do that? We're partnering with the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs in New York, because they tend to bring in executives from all over the world and run these lunchtime workshops. And the usual idea is they bring in some executive and he or she would tell these stories about how they've managed various kinds of international business ethics challenges. Well, now they've decided, let's frame them as GVB scenarios. So they're bringing in an executive and he or she will present the challenge they've had, and they'll say, they'll make it very clear what they thought the right thing to do was. So it's not about what should I have done, but then they'll say, but how could you possibly have gotten that done in this context? And then the people at the workshop will brainstorm some stuff and then share it, and then the executive will tell what he or she really did. They videotape all of these, and then they edit them into cases and responses, and they put them up on iTunes University and make them available for free. So, we're trying to find, this is something I could never do because I didn't have the budget to create these workshops, but we're partnering in that way. So we're doing a lot more of that stuff, but I think we need to do something that steps it up to the next level. I think that's where I want to end it, because I'm hoping that this conversation is both interesting to you in terms of how you can reframe for yourself personally when you encounter ethical challenges, a way of empowering yourself by asking a different question. If you're an educator, I'm hoping it will give you some ideas about what you might do in your teaching. And then I'm also hoping you guys might, be noodling on this idea. So how do you grow something like this and take it to the next level? Especially when, as I usually tell people, this has pretty much been just me and my dog. So, we need to think about how to do this in a smart and strategic way. So that all said, I want to just say thank you very much. It's been great having the chance to tell you the story. There's a lot more I could share, but I want to stop and leave time for some questions and any suggestions. And so let's do that now. So, comments? Questions? Comments? Questions? Ideas?
I have a question. You talked about at the beginning how, and this makes sense, how most of the ethical conflicts.
I'm so glad. Sometimes when you're talking, you're not sure if it makes sense.
The ethical conflicts that your students faced when they wrote their stories seem to be for the interest of profit maximization, or whatever company. So, my question is, what are the odds that? Or it seems like that you're very optimistic about this. That's why you're doing this, because you want to make a difference. How can we expand the values of companies and of business people to put ethical values above profit in terms of importance and decision making within, from the top down,
right?
From the most basic decisions about fudging numbers to decisions at the top about how the business should be run. Are you, and how optimistic are you about bringing in ethical decision making to compete with profit?
It's a really good question, and I think the way you framed it initially is to me saying you, Mary, seem optimistic about this. It's interesting. I don't actually think I am optimistic. I actually think, I started this, as I told you, I had my crisis of faith. I started to think maybe this is all baloney, And what I started to realize is that I needed to I was asking the question kind of in the way you asked it, and that made me feel pretty cynical about it. So I realized I needed to ask the question in another way to unleash not my optimism, but my sense that there's something you can do, that you can, in fact, make a difference. So there's a couple things about that. The first thing is we decided to shift who we thought we were talking to. You talked about you need to influence the senior managers who are making policy decisions all the way down to the newbies who are making decisions about fudging the numbers today. And what we found when we interviewed people, and that's absolutely true, but we found when we interviewed people, if I interviewed somebody very junior in the organization, what they would often say to me is something like, well, Mary, yeah, of course I'd like to act on my values, but I'm really junior in this organization. I don't really have any power. I don't really have any legitimate authority. I don't have any, real influence levers or reputational capital. It's really pretty risky for me to do something kind of counterculture here. When I get to be more senior, when I get to be CEO, I can make a difference. But right now it's pretty hard. And then we would interview CEOs and CFOs, C-suite type people. And they'd say, well, Mary, of course I'd like to act on my values. But I've got a lot of people relying on me, shareholders, employees, customers, suppliers. It's pretty risky for me to make some of these choices. If I was lower down in the organization, it would be easier to do this. And then we would interview people in the middle, and they'd say, well, sure, I'd like to act on my values, but I'm getting squeezed from both sides. So basically what we heard were reasons why it was impossible to do this no matter where you were in the organization. But nevertheless, we found people at every level in the organization who found a way to voice and act on their values. What we learned is that you do different things. You have different degrees of freedom. You have different levers you can pull. You may have a bigger or smaller immediate impact. But the point is that you're part of that ongoing conversation. And so what we started to say to people is that, this isn't easy. And we say this to the students. We're kind of believing in informed consent here. This isn't easy. And isn't even always possible. Okay? But it is important. And we think you can get better at it if you practice. So the question here is not so much, can you learn to, will you do this or won't you do this? The question is, we're going to give you practice and rehearsal so this comes more naturally, so that it becomes more of your default behavior and all that research I was talking about. And the other thing that we did, which it didn't mean I was more optimistic, it just meant I had a different target, is that we changed who we thought we were talking to. So when I first started doing this work, I would sit in rooms with senior business school faculty. I remember actually sitting in a room to design the first required ethics program at HBS, and that week there'd been an article in the student newspaper. It was like a humorous op-ed, and one of the MBA students, this was back in the late 80s, there were a lot of LBOs, lots of leveraged buyouts, and there was a student who'd written an article that said, we MBA students, we're the kind of people who would do a leveraged buyout of our grandmother if we thought we could make a profit at it, and it was kind of a humorous bravado piece. But I remember one of the faculty in the room saying, you see this? This is the kind of person we're trying to impact with this course. These are the people we're trying to change. Now, I've decided that's not the way to approach this. And so when we think about this curriculum, we imagine the classroom or the business as a bell curve. And we kind of say at one tail end of the bell curve are the people who would self-identify as opportunists. And we'll define opportunists as people who would say, I will always maximize my material self-interest. Values be damned. Okay? Those are the ones LBOing their grandmothers. And then at the other tail end of the bell curve are the people who would self-identify as idealists. And then we define idealists as people who would say, I will always try to act according to my values, regardless of the impact on my material self-interest. What we assume is that the majority of the students in the classroom fall under the bell. I put myself there. And we define those people as pragmatists. And we define pragmatists as people who would say, I would like to act according to my values, as long as it doesn't put me at a systematic disadvantage. Now, that's not the same as saying as long as I know I will succeed. It's not the same as saying as long as I'm sure I won't lose. It simply means I think I have a shot. And so if you think of what you're doing when you're trying to teach, and this is why I think I haven't become an optimist, I just become more pragmatic, I actually don't believe I can change the opportunists. I don't think I have the power. I'm not sure I have the legitimacy. I'm not so worried about the idealists, except I wish they were more skillful. But what we can do is actually help the pragmatists to gather the examples, the skills, the tools, the frameworks, the scripts, the literal scripts, and most importantly, as I said earlier, the rehearsal, the practice, to be who they already want to be at their best. And so by shifting who I'm thinking I'm teaching to, I'm no longer walking into the classroom and thinking, I want to convince that person sitting up there who's smirking at me, you know? I mean, he or she is still there, and I have conversations with them. But what I really want to do is empower the people in the room who may or may not be saying that much, but actually want to get more skillful at doing this so that they feel like they have an option. And the reason is because when I would interview people who had not voiced their values, and I asked them why they hadn't, usually what people will say is, I didn't have a choice. Okay? And they really believe that. And so what I figure is, I can't make someone make a choice. What I can do is help them have a choice. What we're trying to do is give them skills and practice and tools and scripts so there's something they can put on the other side of the scale. Now, you still have to decide which one to take, but now you have a choice. So when you say, so I don't think I'm optimistic, I just think I got smarter about who to talk to, you know? And whether I'm optimistic about changing the world, changing the organizations, the other thing that I think the opportunist will always be with us. You know, I don't think that's going away. I'm not even sure it should. The thing is, I want there to be more of a level playing ground. I want the pragmatists to get skillful. And I actually think that if the pragmatists were more skillful, the opportunistic thing to do would be to go along with them, you know? So you don't really even have to change them. They can stay opportunists, you know? But it's a little different way of framing your question.
Great. Thanks.
Yeah, John.
So I've got a quick question that involves our community, and you certainly mentioned the liberal arts.
Yeah.
So if much of the magic of what you do is having situations where people know what the right thing to do is, and it's how to get it done, and as you said, the tactics. In our community, I think for students, let's say who are under the bell curve, that would be true in two very troubling areas here. And I think it's not, what I'm about to describe is not unique to our campus. One is abuse of alcohol, and the other is cheating, academically. Both of those are stubbornly...
Not unique to Middlebury. I mean, read what's been going on in the Harvard campus.
Right.
About
So
cheating.
they're stubbornly at a level that we consider too high. So are there examples of using your approach within a liberal arts community for things like that?
Yeah, actually there are. Now, I don't consider myself an expert on substance abuse, you know. But what I found is the more I go around sharing this approach, the more people will raise questions like that and think about how else it could be applied. I'm going to give you an example, but I want to first just say that one of the things that comes up a lot is not just applying it in different disciplines or professions, but people who say, could I use this in raising my kids? You know? And I actually now get emails from faculty who are B-school faculty who came to my talk because they wanted to use it in their teaching. But then they write me about how they're using it with their kids, you know. I was a visiting senior scholar at the U.S. Air Force Academy in February. The Air Force Academy is now using GBV. And one of the colonels there, who, unbeknownst to me, when he was introducing me, started telling me that after he'd heard about GBV, he started using it raising his daughters, you know, and how effective it had been. So I think there are uses. I think there are actually people who are doing that more systematically. But let me talk about the cheating one, because I have a better example on that than I do on the substance abuse one. There's a professor at the University of Richmond Rob Phillips. He's pretty well known in the field of leadership and ethics in the business school world. And he heard me speaking at Brigham Young University about GBV, and then later at a United Nations Global Compact meeting. And so he was intrigued. So he wrote me, he emailed me about 6 months later and said, I liked what you were doing, and I teach a senior level leadership and ethics class, undergraduate class. And he said what he did is he created several cheating scenarios. There were like different types of cheating. They're the kind where you're in the room and someone wants you to cheat during the test, but also the kind where a friend comes to you before a class, and asks you to set it up, or a friend asks you to help them plagiarize a paper. So there's a lot of different levels and types. And he said he created several different scenarios, and then he broke the students into teams, and he gave them the scenarios, and they were supposed to work in teams to come up with their script, their action plan, what they actually could imagine literally saying, because it's hard to say to a friend, no, I won't let you cheat. So, it's like, what could I literally say and not feel too self-conscious about? And they worked together to come up with something. And then once they came up with the best thing that they could come up with, they videoed themselves doing this, kind of enacting it. And then they posted all these videos on a closed YouTube site. So anyone in this class both had the experience with a peer working together to figure out how to say no to cheating. Now, when do you get to do that, right? Usually you feel totally alone when your friend asks you to cheat. But here I'm working with a friend to figure out what I might say and not feel stupid. And then, if you go to the class, you not only have done that, but you get to see as many teams as there are in the class. You get to see, 10 more different approaches. So I thought that was a pretty ingenious approach. Now, whether it's changed the level of cheating, I'm not sure. But I actually think it's an interesting way to begin to approach this issue. I also would just mention there's a school in Ghana, Ashesi University, that a couple faculty there have a blog, and I put Giving Voice to Values on Google Alerts a few years ago when I first started it. And so one day, this is now probably 3 years ago, I got a Google alert that some professor in Ghana was writing about Giving Voice to Values on her blog. So I read her blog, and she was talking about how we're developing a leadership experience for all our freshmen at Ashesi University. And we came across this curriculum developed by these people in Boston. It's called Giving Voice to Values, and it's really a simple idea, but we thought it was very practical. But we needed to adapt it to our context. And so what they did is they created a 5-week leadership ethics experience for all the freshmen. It uses all the Giving Voice to Values pieces, but they created a bunch of, the GVV cases are short. They created a bunch of GVV cases based on what their freshman students in the Ghanaian context might encounter. So I've posted these now on our website. And it's pretty interesting what they've done. And the stories are interesting because, sure enough, some of them are cheating, the same things we're dealing with. But there was also, I thought they all were things that were quite relevant. I was wondering how different they would be. And one of them was a young woman whose roommate she thought was getting beaten by her boyfriend. She wasn't sure. The girl denied it, but she was pretty sure. And she was trying to figure out, how could I say something? What could I do? There was another one with a young man who had a summer job working for his uncle, and his uncle was asking him to do something unethical in the business. And so it was like, what would you say? But so they were interesting to me. The ways in which they were similar and the ways in which they were different. But they've been using that now for about 3 years. And this year, they're actually, in addition to using their own cases, they've decided to use a whole group of cases that we developed for freshmen at Babson. So there'll be kind of this sort of joint pilot going on between Ghana and Boston, which I think will be cool. So that's all a long answer to saying I think there are applications to it. It's not my area of expertise. So I can't promise it works, but it seems reasonable to me. Yeah.
So I'm a philosopher and I teach ethics.
In business school or in a philosophy
No,
class?
here in a university, so in the philosophy department. And I guess I just want to say that I appreciate your point that what we do in philosophical ethics is look at analysis and what was the other one? Awareness. And I think that where there's a mistake made, and I think it's a really common mistake, is to think that that's not what we're doing. is to take classes that we do in philosophical ethics to be substitutes for ethical training.
Yeah.
When in fact that's not
You're trying to do something different.
that that we're doing something different, you know, I mean, and I think, you know, when I go into class, I see the purpose of my class is to teach great thinkers, right, which I think is really important and meaningful for me, but it's certainly not ethical training. With that in mind, though, you know, I mean, I do think.
Can I just, don't lose your point, but can I just interject? I agree with that, and I wanted to say that I think often what happens in business schools is that because the fact they don't feel comfortable talking about ethics, they kind of want to outsource it to you guys in philosophy and think that they've therefore done it, and they're not recognizing what you just said.
Right. And I mean, I think it's really tricky. Even, you know, this is our first week of class, so I've been trying to tell my students, I don't know if anywhere in here, like, this is not, you know, I'm not training you, right? I'm not telling you what to think, but I'm
Helping you think well.
Right. But so I recognize the distinction between our basic enterprises, and I think, you know, I just think it's a confusion on a very different level. But I also want to defend the thinking a little bit more, you know, and I'm sure you've heard this kind of criticism before. But in talking about scripts and practicing and things like that, right, there's a kind of sense in which you're, you know, building ethical soldiers, right? Not that that's wrong, but you know, the practices that you described, it reminds me of, you know, training that soldiers go through so that they develop the muscle memory and then can shoot when they need to.
In an emergency, yes, it comes in.
So I'm kind of worried about that. And I'm just, so where do you see, I know you're pretty confident that the situations are going to be similar enough that this isn't going to be problematic,
Right.
but I'm still skeptical a little bit about that.
So it's a really, really good point, and it's actually something I didn't include in my talk today because I thought I was going too long, but I'll throw it out now, which is that we actually had 3 things that we call the GBB reversals or flips, thinking differently about what we're doing. And remember, this is about business ethics, teaching in a business context. It's not about a philosophy class. The second one I just talked about with this gentleman over here, which is we flipped who we thought we were teaching and practice rather than the opportunity. The first one is we flipped what we thought we were teaching. So typically, when business school faculty try and think about teaching ethics in business school, they often borrow from, either they bring in philosophers or they borrow from the philosophy model, that what they're going to do is, and this is kind of also received wisdom, you know, they say, we're not going to focus on the black and white issues, the clear-cut issues. We're going to focus on the gray issues, because those are the ones that really hone your thinking. Those are the ones that really teach you to be, you know, rigorous about and disciplined about how you reason through these things. And they make sure that you don't just assume that you know it's right. So this is good. However, what we sort of say is that, you know, those gray issues are also the areas where often reasonable people of goodwill and intelligence could legitimately disagree. I mean, that's why the debates are so important. That's why the debates are so lively, you know, and intellectually stimulating. And so what we say is that that's great, but let's take a look at those more clear-cut issues. And what we say to people is, look, we're going to choose issues where most people, not everybody, but most people would agree this is the right thing to do, the wrong thing to do. And we take clearly the easier issues. You know, this is clearly illegal and not one of those legal things where it might be legal but it's still unethical. This is clearly, you know, deceit. This is clearly fraud, whatever. We take those because we say we're trying to shift the thinking and the ability around those issues. And then we say, you know, we actually believe that if once you've done that, you're going to be better at being able to talk about the gray issues as well. But the other thing is that we have a template. So we name right up front. We're choosing an issue that most people, not everyone, will agree is the right thing to do. The other thing we say is that we have a template you have to go through in terms of the set of questions to ask. Now the questions are things like stating what the values position is, clearly, identifying what's at risk for everyone involved, you know, stakeholder analysis, but not to do a stakeholder analysis, pros and cons, weighing, utilitarian, consequentialist kind of thing, but rather from a strategic perspective. So if I know what's at risk for you, I'm better able to think about how to maybe help address that. Then an issue about what are the most common objections you'll hear. We call them reasons and rationalizations, and then we ask them to develop levers. What we find is that if they go through that template in the service of creating a script and an action plan, if there truly is an issue with the actual stand that they're taking, it starts to surface. So you're not necessarily creating an unthinking ethical soldier. You know, what you are doing is actually teaching them to use that process of reasoning in the surface of implementation, but they still have to go through that process of reasoning. And what I always say to people is that this is not to replace awareness and analysis. Ideally, in a business school, you're going to have all three of these things. What we often find is that you have none of them, or you have just pieces of, awareness and analysis. As I was saying earlier, the philosophers pull out their hair the way it's sometimes taught. So I'm not as worried about that. I understand what you're saying, but I actually think in practice, the way it's come out, it's never that rote. You know what I mean? So I don't know if that addresses it. Yep.
So teaching people how to take action seems like a great first step. But a lot of these people that are learning it are going to be in business school, and they're going to end up in managerial positions, presumably. Is there any component of the course teaching them to kind of like receive people who are taking action?
That's a great question. In fact, I was at a meeting just a couple of weeks ago with a bunch of managers, and they said, it was just one of those fluff questions, at the end, but they said, "So Mary, what's your next book going to be?" And so if I had time to write a next book, what I told them was, this book was about learning to voice your values. I want the next book to be about how to hear people who are voicing their values, because I absolutely think that's essential. Because if you are in a leadership position at any level in the organization, it's not easy to have someone come to you with these kinds of things and put them on the table. So how do you hear them without being defensive? How do you create a culture that empowers people to speak in this way? We do have a part of the curriculum which I didn't discuss here. There's a lot more pieces to it that I didn't go through, but we do have a part where we talk about how to create a culture that will empower voice. And so that's a bit of what you're asking. But the other thing I can say is that one kind of cool example of trying to address the concern you raised is at Lockheed Martin. They created these videos, and often it's a junior person having to figure out how to speak out against the senior person. So when they use those videos with junior people, they do traditional GVB. When they use those scenarios with senior people, they talk to them about what they could be doing if they were in the role of that senior person to have made it more constructive and more empowering and more effective, more efficient, to actually resolve the issue. So I thought that was an interesting approach. But the question is absolutely right on, and I actually think it should be the next book. But thanks. Yeah.
Well, I'm also a philosopher, but I don't teach ethics, so I don't know if that makes a difference. I just wanted to I think actually can be friendlier to analysis than you have been. And you said it was insufficient, but it seems to me that was what was insufficient with your example was the teaching of the analysis, not the analysis itself, because what you gave was a guy who said, well, this is what I want to do, and so I'm going to come up with some post hoc reasoning, but of course, post hoc reasoning isn't good analysis, right? And so what I would say is, it seems to me that the sort of more fruitful way of thinking about this is that the action component of what you're doing is actually making people better analysts, which I take it as a friend.
That is absolutely.
But I guess one thing I want to get clear about with the sort of pedagogical method that you're using here is it seems like it's going to be very sensitive to audiences, right? Mm-hmm. And some of the psychological literature on this I think is really interesting. So it turns out that people are actually much better reasoners when they don't know the views of their audience.
Yes.
And where they, once you start to know people, you start to basically accommodate their views. And I was just wondering, how do you accommodate for that, or how do you sort of teach that?
Yeah. So one thing I would just say about that, before I go directly to the last part of your question, is that one of the articles that influenced me a lot in developing this was Jonathan Haidt's article about the, emotional tail that wags the rational dog, how we do so much post hoc reasoning to justify our instinctive emotional or reactions, kind of what you were talking about in the earlier part of your conversation. So that's part of why we're, the research around responding to that is in fact a research around practice reversal. So that's part of what we responded to. Now the other question you asked though was at the very end.
Was your method seems very sensitive to the audiences who are sort of, giving feedback to people going through these scenarios. And a lot of the psychological literature seems to suggest that at least when we know the views of our audience, we tend to sort of gerrymander or conform more to what we think they want. When we have an unknown audience, we actually tend to reason much better. And so I was wondering how you account for that.
So what we've done, I think in a way, our process that we've created is actually a chance for them to practice before that week begins. Because what we've done is, we always say to people, a lot of times people will hear me describe this and they'll say, so they go, you give them these scenarios and then they do role play. And what I usually say is, actually it's not a role play. It's not an adversarial role play. It is in fact a situation, we call it the GBV thought experiment, where we say, we're not asking you what you would do, we're asking you to act as if this is what you were going to do. And then we actually ask the rest of the group, the audience, to play a similar role, being on your sort of side, in that, to coach you and make it more effective. Now, what we ask them to do in that process, so now we've already positioned them with one perspective, but then we ask them to say, okay, now think about every stakeholder involved with this, and identify what's at risk for all of them involved. And so we do ask them to practice going through all those things that would influence your decision making. But then you are consciously and explicitly being asked to assume the role that you're voicing this perspective that's already been set. So that's one way we try and address that. The other way we try and address that is that we actually have a set of readings that share with them a lot of the research on decision-making biases and heuristics, a lot of the social psychology stuff, and stuff around, social reference groups and false consensus and groupthink and, discounting the future and over-optimism, all that kind of stuff. And so we name all of that, and then we say, now usually this gets shared with you with the idea that this will make you proof against it, right? But we know from the research that doesn't work. We know that it might make me recognize it when you fall prey to it, but I'm still going to be vulnerable to it. So what we say is, if I know these biases develop for evolutionarily valid reasons, right? So if I know that people tend to discount the future, or I know that they create this false idea of a false bias, or are vulnerable to things, I can name that bias, and then I can actually try and frame a response that uses that bias explicitly, not in a manipulative way. And so I think by doing all of this kind of informed consent, naming our process to the degree that we can, we're trying to address the concern you're talking about. Whether it's always effective, I don't know, but I actually think it has a much better shot than what we've been doing traditionally in the physical classroom. Yeah.
I was just wondering, so you said that you have ethics programs for people who are on in the business workforce and have experience. Do you think it would be beneficial for those who have not yet entered the workforce? And also, the second question is that since this is just, I don't know if this is like some thing program in business school, do you think it would be beneficial if it was ongoing for someone's career?
Yeah. So the first question, I think that would be great. I think actually the business school classroom is hopefully one way of doing what you just suggested, which is having some training before you actually get into the business world and learn some of these tools. And the good news is one of the things that I've started to hear back from faculty is that they're starting to get students who will email them or call them after they've graduated and say, I'm in my new job, something came up, I remembered my GVV experiences, and I actually tried it and it worked. So we feel like that's having an impact in exactly the way we talked about. Now, in terms of how long this lasts and whether it should be spread out, absolutely. Our idea when we designed this is to try and create, we never envisioned it as a course in GVV. We didn't even envision it as necessarily something that should go into the business ethics class, because we thought the business ethicists were actually already doing awareness and analysis very effectively. Increasingly, they're working in a lot of the new research to make it more nuanced. What we wanted to do was design a curriculum that could maybe reasonably, and with some hope of success, be integrated into the other courses, the non-ethics courses. Because the holy grail in business school education has always been, let's just not just have business ethics class, so we're not going to finance or marketing and, all bets are off. Let's actually try and have some of these concerns carry over across the curriculum. And so we were trying to design a curriculum that didn't require faculty to pretend they were philosophers when they weren't. It didn't require them to be comfortable with leading that kind of discussion when they weren't. which respected the fact that they already had a lot of content they had to cover in their own discipline, whether it's finance or marketing or accounting, and which actually gave the students a chance to practice using the tools and language of that discipline in the service of a values-based position. So our idea was, hopefully this will be something that will be across your whole curriculum. Now the idea that then carrying on into the rest of your life, I love it. That would be great if people started doing it. When we started doing this, we really, my expertise was not in designing corporate education programs. It was around business education. And so that's one of the reasons I've been so pleased when companies have started coming to us and say, can we use pieces of this to change the way we do the ongoing, continued refreshing and expanding leadership development and values and ethics training. But that's still at the early stages. It's a handful of companies that are doing that. But I agree. Thanks.
Yeah. Mary, I know there are probably many more questions, but some of them we're going to have to wait till dinner. If you don't mind, I'd just like to share something you said as you began, as you talked about the sort of crisis you were having, and your words were you wanted to find meaning in your life. And I love that so much, and I think something I always say to my students is that's what the liberal arts experience is about. What is the meaning of my life? And one of your great Yale University Press colleagues, Anthony Froman, has a book with that title. So I appreciate that so much. It's great to hear that presented to first-year students who are here.
And can I just say that I don't think I ever would have thought of GVV if I hadn't had a liberal arts background.
Wow.
My doctorate is in literature and film. And what I really see, not in business, and what I really see GVV is about is taking the same set of facts that a business school student or a business faculty member would look at, or a business practitioner, and creating a different narrative around that, where some other form of action is possible. And I don't think I would have thought that way about narrative and the power of narrative and the power of story to change how you lead your life and what you think is possible if I hadn't been trained.
That's fantastic. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all.